Hello, my fellow Ever-Thinkers. Welcome to the Ever-Curious podcast. I'm Oscar Rackwell, and I'm joined today on co-hosting duty by the true mastermind of this project.
Thank you, Oscar.
And we are honored to be joined by the Associate Professor at the Department of Radiology, specializing in photochemistry and photopharmacology, Dr. Wiktor Szymanski. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us, and we're so happy to have you here.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It is me who is honored to be here. I had no clue we had such a recording studio in the building where I work. Cool stuff, and great to be here. I think your initiative is an important one. We spoke about it a bit before and how it came for your feelings about what students were missing during COVID times. As a professor at this university, thanks so much for reaching out with initiatives like that. Let's make something good out of it.
Perfect. Thanks so much. We'll give you the floor for the first few minutes. I would like you to tell us a little bit about yourself from your own perspective, not from what we read online. So give us a little story or just a small introduction to who you are, where you came from.
Well, I'm originally Polish. I did my studies in Poland. And actually, I came up doing chemistry as a complete accident. So in 2000, I finished my my high school, let's say secondary school, I'm not sure what it's called over here. Yeah. Anyway, I got my A grades, you know, and I was really into doing genetic engineering. I really wanted to do that. I was really hype back then. So I decided I have to study biotechnology, which I did, or I enrolled to the program at Warsaw University of Technology, and quickly learned two things. First, it has nothing to do with biotechnology. They just called it like that because there was money flowing to programs of this name. It's actually chemistry that they were teaching at Faculty of Chemistry. Well, big surprise. And the second thing I realized is they actually like chemistry much more than doing, genetic engineering. So that's more or less how I came to do chemistry, then medicinal chemistry a little bit for my master's. Then I started my PhD in biocatalysis.
Okay.
It's using enzymes basically to make chemistry, right? So you make molecules not by throwing artificial catalysts, but throwing biocatalysts inside. So that was something that I really liked. And then I ended up in Groningen by complete accident. I actually followed my wife to Groningen.
Okay.
So she was doing her PhD in parallel. I was doing, biocatalysis. She was doing microfluidics. So using, very small channel machines to do chemistry on very small scale and analysis on very small scale. And we had chance to go for Erasmus exchange during our PhD. And one of the big groups in microfluidics is at Faculty of Pharmacy here in Groningen.
Yeah.
So the group of Sabbath right? So that's where my wife went, and I kind of tagged along, and I started looking for organic chemistry group, and there was a group of Ben Feeringa here who accepted me for 3 months. And that's how I ended up in Groningen after that with a postdoc, and that's how it all started.
Wow.
So that's my background.
Fantastic.
Following love.
Must have been a very nice experience actually with Ben Feeringa. He recently, 2016, has won the Nobel Prize. But the same research you're doing, right? The molecular molecular engineering, if I may say it this way.
No, his Nobel Prize is for molecular machines. So making molecules which are motors, right? It kind of plugs into what we do because it's still molecules and light. We just use it for something a bit different. But yes, everything we have developed was started kind of with him and within his group. So I started here doing BioCat for 2008, 2010. But then the project ended and I moved to working closer with Ben in 2010. And he basically very clearly indicated, let's take our photochemical processes and do something in bio with them, right? So that's how the whole program started that culminated in Photopharmacology 2013, more or less, right? And then came 2016. And I've told this story many times, so I won't do that again. But I was actually in his office when he got the phone call.
Nice.
And he found out he got a Nobel Prize, finished the meeting without telling us anything, just continued.
Wow.
And then, but yes, that was and is still quite an experience.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Wow. Fantastic. I guess, yeah, to pivot kind of to the meat and potatoes, because you did mention photochemistry and even catalysis regarding it. Could you explain to the audience, when people hear the terms photochemistry and photopharmacology, what does this all entail?
Well, photochemistry is using light to do chemistry.
Mm-hmm.
Chemistry is making, breaking, or isomerizing bonds. That's what it boils down to, right?
Yeah.
So in photochemistry, we can use light, and by that we usually use UV visible light, let's say, because this is the type of light that molecules like to absorb, to bring those molecules into excited state and then do something interesting with them. If we go a bit more narrow, you can think that this breaking, making, isomerizing of bonds can be used to apply light to change activity of bioactive molecules, change activity of drugs. And I'll be happy to explain, of course, more in detail how we do that, but that's the whole idea of photopharmacology. Yeah. We make drugs that can be operated with light, that you can activate, inactivate, etc., using light. And by light, I really mean what allows us to see each other, right? So that I think is the first association with photochemistry and photopharma.
Very good. Of course, photopharmacology is, well, it sounds and it is a very cool idea, just controlling things with light. But one of the things that has surprised me is that it's not particularly a new idea. It has been used in the history of human civilization before, Egyptians and the Indian teaching, maybe it was mentioned. Could you say something about that, maybe?
Yeah, it's actually, it's not actually photopharmacology which was used back then. Pharmacology itself dates back to late 60s, I would say, right, of the previous century. But the whole idea of using light in medicine, indeed, is much older than you know, what we would call science or scientific method. It's many thousand years old, and the example you gave of it being used in ancient Egypt was something very simple, in which they would take certain plants and take extracts of their plants, or just grind them, put it on the skin, and go to the sun, and something would happen, right? They would use it to treat vitiligo or to treat leprosy. And that's a very important hint for us, because already they then knew that just going to the sun will not do the job. There must be something to translate sunlight into some kind of physiological or biomedical or clinical effect, right? They didn't know it has to be a molecule. For them it was, an extract of a plant. We now know that it is a molecule that can do that. And if we look at those plants that they have used, we know indeed that those plants contain molecules that will absorb light and go to excited state, and from this excited state do something interesting. In that case, it wasn't per se chemistry, so no bonds were broken, but the energy that the molecule gains by going to excited state was given away then to oxygen, forming singlet oxygen species, which are very, very reactive, and they burn things. So, a few thousand years old idea that we still use in the clinics now. We just don't call it magic. We don't call it heliotherapy, as the Greeks would call it afterwards. We call it photodynamic therapy, right?
And that's used for cancer, right? Photodynamic therapy.
It's used for multiple indications. Cancer is a very good one because it's one of the reasons why you would like to burn out tissues. It is also used in more cosmetic therapy, in skin treatments, etc. But for us, from clinical perspective, the main application is indeed cancer, especially cancers that you can reach easily with light. So cutaneous T-cell lymphoma would be a great example, right? It's basically on the skin. Melanoma would be a great example. It's basically on the skin. The second emerging application of photodynamic therapy is not cancer, but bacterial infections. Maybe we can use the same trick to burn away bacteria, which is very important because, of course, bacteria are very good in developing resistance to whatever antibiotic we throw on them. Well, good luck to them to develop resistance against something that basically burns them out. They probably will, and it's going to be a scary day when they do. But for now, we haven't observed anything like that happening.
Yeah, and the idea is that we will burn bacteria so that no bacteria will remain to reproduce and replicate and give rise to new mutations.
Yeah, and I mean, you know, when you put antibiotics on bacteria, then of course you will kill 99% of them, but there's the 1% that will in some way be resistant because they already contain the genes that encode the resistance to a certain antibiotic. And under normal situation, this gene doesn't give them any advantage over its colleagues. It has to compete with them for the same resources. But suddenly you're putting antibiotic there and you're changing conditions and you're promoting this 1% that is resistant.
Yeah.
You kill the other ones and suddenly this 1% has all the food, all the space out there.
Okay.
It's going to multiply, and within this 100% that develop from this 1% of resistant, there will be another 1% of super resistant ones, etc., etc. And that's how we as humanity drive ourselves to the ground with overusing antibiotics.
Yeah, and but if I may, if I understand it correctly, we cannot use photopharmacology, especially in the area of bacterial resistance. We can only use it in hospital settings, so we cannot use it casually. And also resistance can rise from just casual settings and situations where all the bacteria is not very strong, or the patient does not have to be hospitalized. So how much can photopharmacology be a winning factor regarding that it's only used in hospitals?
Well, what we try to do is, you know, this development of resistance and spreading of resistant genes happens not only in clinics, happens not only in sick patients at homes, it happens in the environment. And it has been shown multiple times that the fact that we flood our rivers with antibiotics, and Netherlands is in a bad situation, being the sink of Europe. We are not the overusers of antibiotics, but you know, French are. What we could try to achieve is make sure that this doesn't happen, that the antibiotics that end up in environment are in a way inactive. So they do not put evolutionary pressure on bacteria. And that's what photopharma comes in, because if you can have an antibiotic which is inactive until you irradiate it with special type of light, then you know it doesn't raise resistance. You irradiate it, you activate it, you give it to a patient, and you design it in such a way that over a course of hours it's going to switch itself off. So the moment it ends up in environment, it will have switched itself off, removing this problem. Now, the good thing here in this kind of thinking is that the irradiation, the activation of the drug with light happens outside of patient's body. So it's thinkable to assume that you can do it also outside of clinics. You don't have to go with your light somewhere inside the patient in an invasive way. You basically have a special lamp, you put your pill in the lamp, right? You eat it and that's it.
Yeah.
That's of course far future, but something we would like to build towards.
Is there anything in the clinic at the moment or in a clinical trial regarding the photopharmacological drugs for antibiotics?
Antibiotics, no. To my best knowledge, no. The use of light, I mean, we should probably a bit go back to the basics of photopharmacology here, right? But photopharmacology has two main modes of action. So I said, you know, you can use light to activate a drug. And one of the ways to do that is something I would call reversible way. So what you do is you put a molecular photo switch, a small molecule that under the action of light is able to change its shape, properties, etc. in a reversible fashion. And you embed this photo switch into a drug, antibiotic, chemotherapeutic, you name it. So compounds of this kind are not yet very much in the clinic. But there are two things I need to mention. First of all, an important clinical application which is there and is quite widespread is something called the Billy lights, right? You might have heard about it. It happens that when children are born, they, of course, require lots of hemoglobin metabolism. They produce lots of blood. They go through it, right? And it might be that their livers are not yet developed enough to be able to process all those hemoglobin degradation products such as bilirubin, right? And this bilirubin happens to be quite toxic. And basically, children get jaundice. It's called neonatal jaundice. They become yellow, right? When you know the general jaundice problem. In the old days, a midwife would tell the mother, take the child out to the sun. It's going to help, right? And it's true. It does help. But by now we know that this bilirubin, this toxic product, which is residing in the child's body, is in fact a photoswitch. It has two forms that you can switch with light. One form which is less soluble and toxic, and the other form which is more soluble and can be processed by the child's body. What the sun does is it switches the toxic form to the non-toxic form. And it's exactly a molecular photoswitch, a natural one, right, in a way. So what we do these days is, instead of relying on sun, and in Netherlands it's not maybe very smart to rely on sun every day, we use blue lights, because it's blue light that does this trick. In the old days, or old days, you know, a decade ago you would put a child into an incubator filled with blue lights, which is of course not good if you just given birth and you want to hold your child all the time, right? That's what we should enable young mothers to do. So there are also Billy blankets. It's basically a blanket that you would put your child in anyway, but it's lined with blue LEDs inside, and the child is, you know, it looks pretty fun. If you Google Billy blanket, you're going to get pretty fun pictures on this. And it is fun because it helps and it saves lives, right? When it comes to proper photopharmacology, so the one done with, you know, photo switches, synthetic photo switches that we have developed or others have developed, there is at this point first clinical trial running on the use of photopharmacology in fixing vision problems. That's an obvious target for photopharma, right? Eyes are easy to be reached with light, right? So there are degeneration diseases in which the neurons get to some extent degraded in the eye, and they cannot perform their job correctly. But if we inject them with those photo switches that act in fact as ion channel effectors, the sun can be hitting a switch which will result in neuronal signal going to the brain and will result in some kind of vision. Which brings me to a very key question that I don't know. So we know that there is at least one person in Australia walking around with photo switch injected in their eye that should be responsive to a certain color of light. What does this person see? No clue. Well, I don't know who that is. I cannot ask him. But probably in the coming months, it will be published to some extent, and we'll find out, right? Some kind of vision is enabled, but is it monochromatic then? Is it full color? Probably not. Well, interesting to find out.
Interesting. And of course, the retina is one of our inspirations regarding photopharmacology and photo switches, since the retina is a photo switch, as you mentioned.
Retinal is, yes, absolutely. So, you know, a very fundamental question: how do I see you? The reason I see you is that there is a lamp over there, right, which is sending photons that are bouncing off you, hitting my eye, and in my eye there is also a photo switch, a natural one, retinal, right, which is sitting in an opsin protein, and it's exactly the same process. This photon that bounces off you and goes to my eye isomerizes this photo switch, and the opsin protein senses that and you know, sends, or this starts a whole biochemical cascade downstream that will send a signal to the brain, which our brain is able to interpret in the end as you know, seeing the world.
And maybe that's a good time also to talk about the interaction of light with the with bodies and with the objects. So when you said that the photon will hit me and it will bounce back, from my understanding, it will first be absorbed and re-emitted with a different wavelength. Is that correct?
No. So we're getting into area of photophysics that it's absolutely far away from my comfort zone. But let's try to say something, and then you know, maybe we have physicists watching who can comment more on that.
Sure.
Exactly. Normal reflection, right? So the photon coming in, coming out, doesn't really change its color, right? So how exactly it happens, I'm not going to explain. But this doesn't mean that what you described, the absorption emission, doesn't happen. It does. And certain molecules are really, really good in doing this, which brings us to another, actually much more clinically applied at this moment, application of light in medicine, right? Because there are molecules that are able to absorb a photon. Many molecules can do that. And when a molecule in your body, internal one or external one that we add to human body, doesn't matter, when it absorbs a photon, it goes to excited state. Right? That's it. From our perspective, one photon has very little energy. From a perspective of one molecule, it's actually a lot. This molecule in excited state is very hot, very filled with energy, and it's not that comfortable. It would very much like to release this energy somehow and go back to ground state, where it started. Yeah? And there are different ways of losing this energy and going back to ground state. It can do photochemistry. We touched upon this already, right? It can use this energy to break bonds or isomerize bonds, etc. But that's not the only option. The second option is it can go down and, for example, sell the energy to oxygen, forming singlet oxygen. That's what we also described as photodynamic therapy. The third option is it can go back to ground state emissively. So it catches a photon, goes up, loses a bit of energy in excited state, and then falls down emitting a photon of different color. Basics here is different color of light are associated with different energies of photons, right? The bigger the energy, the longer the wavelength of the photon. If we look at our rainbow, rainbow basically is a very nice effect of a prism, you know, diffracting light and spreading it into different energies, going from the lowest energy, red, all the way to highest energy, violet, right? So coming back to molecules absorbing and emitting light, a molecule can absorb light of certain color, and then it usually emits light of lower energy color, right? So it can emit, let's say absorb blue and emit green. It can absorb green and emit red, always losing a bit of energy. Now, why is this useful and why is this interesting? It allows us to search for molecules. It's an idea behind all the fancy microscopies in which we use fluorescence. This is called fluorescence, by the way, right? Emitting and releasing a photon. So it can be good to find molecules on our microscope cover slips with fantastic resolution, looking, inside cells, really where molecules are. But it can also be used in bigger objects than, a tissue sample. It can be used in humans. So that's the whole idea behind fluorescence optical imaging. How would that work? Well, imagine that you have a fluorescence molecule which is able to absorb a certain color of light and emit a different color of light. To that molecule, you're going to attach something that will target it. Target it to an infection site, to a cancer lesion, to a metastasis, etc. Okay? Because this targeting molecule simply on a molecular level binds to those cells because they overexpress certain receptors or whatever. You inject it to a patient. You give it some time to bind where it should. You give it some time to clear from everywhere else. And then the surgeon comes, opens the patient's body, and with a fluorescence camera starts looking where this molecule is. And that's the beauty of fluorescence. You shine one light and you get different light out. If it was just reflection, you shine one light and you get the same light back. That's not interesting, right? If we want to specifically find a molecule, the molecule has to do something with this light, change its color, right? So if we shine blue and start looking for green, we will know where the molecule went. And that's where the surgeon would look at fluorescence camera, take their scalpel, and start cutting out everything that shines, basically, right? Those methods were really pioneered here in Groningen, 2011. A fantastic work from Professor Van who used this to look for metastasis in ovarian cancer patient and be able to find them, even if they're very small, even if surgeons would normally miss them. With this technique, they were able to find them much more precisely and give the patient a better prognosis after operation.
Okay, wow. I'm wondering, is this technique expensive or is it cheap regarding the value or in comparison to the value it offers?
It's actually one of the cheapest imaging techniques out there. Yes, I think we can touch later also on other imaging techniques and other use of photons, not necessarily visible photons.
Yeah.
But you know, a fluorescent camera and the dye that we're injecting are, I'm not saying they're cheap compared to you know our normal prices that we are used to. But compared to your MRI scanners, PET cameras, etc., they are one of the cheapest things available. The challenge here and the limitation, of course, is that visible light doesn't penetrate that deep into human body. And every listener of this podcast can make a very simple experiment by taking their phone, switching on the torch, putting the finger on the phone, and seeing that, well, light goes through your finger, most probably. And importantly, you will see it's a red light that goes through, which is also an important thing to know that red light goes the deepest of all the visible light spectrum. But you know, it will go through your finger, but it will not go through your hand, right? It has a penetration depth, which is inherent to how light interacts with matter. There is a way around it, and I just want to mention it to close the discussion of different ways of what a molecule in excited state can do, right? We already said it can do photochemistry, it can do photosensitization of oxygen, it can do fluorescence, but it can also go back to ground state just by releasing heat, just by thermally getting rid of its energy. What this means is that it's going to send or to locally heat up the tissue around it, So if we now take a laser, which is a pulse laser, so we are sending packages of light inside the human body, the molecules that we want to find absorb this light and cool down or actually heat the tissue around them. And if you heat something, it expands, a thermoelastic expansion, right? So you send light, heat is generated, tissue expands, tissue cools down, you send another package of light, this happens again. So you basically have an area of tissue that is expanding and contracting, and this sends a sound wave through human body. It's not a sound wave we could hear, but our ultrasound transducers that you know very well from, you know, they are most often used, of course, in following pregnancy, right? When you get an ultrasound. Those transducers are able to listen to this kind of light, to this kind of sound, which means we can now deliver light as deep as possible, but we don't have to worry about this light now coming back to our detector because it's the sound that comes back. And sound penetrates much deeper and is attenuated by our tissues much less than visible light. So it's basically listening to light, right? And we can with that increase the penetration depth of imaging a bit more. Now, this method is not yet established in the clinic. We have here at UMCG, we have a scanner that we use on patients, but this is very much, you know, exploratory first in human studies, where we try to look for molecules that absorb, and of course, they can be injected externally, but we also have our internal molecules that absorb. Our blood, especially hemoglobin is fantastic in doing that. And, fun fact, oxidated, or you know, hemoglobin that carries oxygen and it does not, have different spectra. So they absorb different colors of light. And we can unmix this from our signal. So you can even do imaging of veins and arteries, right? Separately and say, you know, which blood carries oxygen, or which vessels carry oxygen, blood vessels, and which do not. So for imaging of these kind of problems, optoacoustic imaging, that's how it's called, might be a very good option.
So for these optoacoustic imaging, we basically, the first package of light we send is using lasers. Are these visible light?
Those are either red or near-infrared light. So we know already that red light penetrates the deepest, right? Near-infrared, so the light which we don't see anymore, but it's very close to red, penetrates even deeper. Those lasers are usually operating in red and near-infrared. So you do see it, and that's why you as a patient and your doctor would be wearing special glasses to protect yourself from this quite strong light.
And how deep can we penetrate? Can we, for example, reach the heart? or the
No,
guts?
well, the problem with our heart, it's mostly hidden behind our bones, right? The collarbone. Light doesn't penetrate the collarbone. Sorry.
Okay.
What my colleagues at UMCG are using it very much for is head and neck imaging,
Yeah.
because there's lots of soft tissues around here. You can start looking for thyroid malignancies, parathyroid malignancies, etc. So our head and neck surgeons and head and neck oncologists are quite excited about that possibility, right?
Yeah, because now I'm just wondering, out of curiosity, this technique is amazing, but it's mainly designed, if I understand it correctly, for imaging, because we're emitting sound back. But for photopharmacology, we need to activate the molecule inside the body.
Exactly.
So how do you penetrate?
How do you get inside human body? Absolutely. That's a big challenge. We are back to visible light with its, let's say, 1 centimeter penetration depth, right? So we sat down with the surgeon once, a few years ago, and we said, okay, let's look at human body and think about how to deliver light to it, right? And the easiest way is to basically stratify human body. We did it into 5 different categories of organs, let's say, in increasing difficulty of reaching with light, right? So category 1 is skin and eyes. That's no-brainer. You can reach skin and eyes by light. Okay, that's easy. Category 2 is organs that lie shallow under the skin, right? As I mentioned, thyroid is a good example. Certain lymph nodes, muscles, etc. If it's within 1 centimeter under the skin, we can probably reach there, right? For imaging, for therapy, anything like this. The third category, which is actually quite vast, is anything that we can reach by endoscopy without incision. So basically using natural openings of human body, right? Whole GI tract, we have colonoscopy, gastroscopy. Whole respiratory system, we can go into lungs with endoscopes quite nicely, right? I'm not saying it's easy, but it's doable. So you can reach everywhere there. Prostate, cervix, ears, you name it, right? So we can reach quite a lot, and we have not touched the person with a scalpel yet, okay? Brings us to category 4, keyhole surgeries. We make very small incision, we get in with a very thin optic fiber, right? And those have been even made biodegradable recently, right? So we can reach quite far using this, using optic fibers. Yes, it is invasive. In the end, you have to stick something possibly deep into human body, right? But it's an option. Which brings us to group 5, anything enclosed within bone structure, right? Brain, bone marrow, etc. It's kind of mission impossible for us, right? Unless we start drilling into human skulls. But I would do that only with very strong indication that there is no other option to go, right? There are other options of reaching targets in our skull with photons, but those are not going to be visible light photons. More on that later, I guess. But here, just to challenge our thinking, I said mission impossible to deliver light over there, right? Okay. What if we don't deliver light there? What if we generate light there? What if we create light somewhere deep in human body? Sounds crazy, and there are different ways that you can think of doing that. The simplest, because it's actually used in animal imaging, is bioluminescence, right? There are proteins that are able to produce light by degrading their substrates. Luciferin luciferase system is a very typical example. There are proteins that don't even need substrates to generate light. The problem is, of course, to express those proteins inside human body, we would have to make genetic manipulations, which is probably not worth it, right? So this is maybe not the way to go. Another way, and we're getting a bit crazier now, to generate light inside the human body is something known as Cherenkov radiation. If you ever have the chance to go to a nuclear reactor, you can look inside and it's going to be blue. This blue thing is called Cherenkov radiation. It's basically particles that change the environment that they go through to environment of a different refractive index. And it's very non-scientific what I'm going to say, but basically quickly realizing that in this environment they are moving too fast and they are breaking certain speed limits. So they need to release their energy quickly, and they do it by shining blue light. If we use radiotherapy, so we actually put isotopes inside people's tumors, we can expect some chunk of radiation also to be formed and activate something. But again, maybe not something that I would call non-invasive, okay? So what we try to focus on now, which is still crazy, but at least less invasive, is a phenomenon known as sonoluminescence.
Sonoluminescence.
Sonoluminescence. So I told you before about optoacoustic imaging, which is light in, sound out. Can we do the other thing? Can we do sound in, light out? Okay.
Smart.
Can we? Theoretically, we can. It is known that if you take very small bubbles of gas and you start hitting them with high-intensity focused ultrasound, those gas bubbles are going to oscillate, and at one point they are going to collapse or burst, right? And when this happens, light is produced. And don't ask me how, because people have not yet agreed on how. It's actually, that's why I love it. It works, nobody knows how. Awesome, right? But considering the fact that we are using high-intensity focused ultrasound in medicine, also here in Groningen, that this kind of ultrasound can penetrate to skull, to the brain, and that we also use microbubbles of gas for completely different reason. We use them as contrast agents for ultrasound imaging. Maybe we can use those two already applied methods in clinic, put them together, and start generating light somewhere. We probably can. At this point, I know that this light is not going to be strong enough to operate our light-controlled drugs, but that's why we have recently created a team of researchers from all over Europe who will, on one hand, try to boost the intensity of light we get from bubbles, on the other hand, lower the requirements of light on our molecules, and maybe those levels at one point are going to meet. We will create enough light and need not much of it to actually activate the drug even inside the bone. So yeah, that's...
Cool. And then, but sorry, do we need gas also with the ultrasound?
We need very small gas bubbles.
How do we get the gas into with a human brain, for example?
Oh, you just inject it intravenously. It's been done all over the place.
No side effects, because, I mean, the brain, you know?
No, well, if you don't hit them with ultrasound, they just flow through bloodstream and don't do much, and they get then cleared from human body. When we do hit them with ultrasound, we might locally disrupt the vasculature because they do stay in blood, which is not that bad because it has been shown in the past to be able to help drugs, not photoactivated drugs even, locally pass the blood-brain barrier. And as pharmacists, you probably know that this is a challenge, right? So if you can locally, just by oscillating the bubble, not even bursting it, transiently permeabilize the blood-brain barrier and deliver something that might be cool. So if we now can also, connect it to attachment or to activation with light, that might be awesome. Although I have to admit, this is a rather complicated system that we propose. And let me tell you, after 8 years of working in hospital, doctors like it simple. So we probably have to do it first complicated way and then start removing everything which is unnecessary and make it basically a plug-and-play system.
Cool, perfect.
Perfect.
Okay. Sounds like a perfect time to take a little break.
Take a break and refresh our minds from the very complex ideas on the edge of sci-fi and true science.
Perfect.
Yeah. So welcome back. We have talked generally about photopharmacology and about the applications and the potential applications of photopharmacology. I want now to get more specific on the photochemistry. So what are the different chemical molecules that we are using for photopharmacology?
Yes, so indeed, let's systematize this a little bit because we were, I think, covering the general topic of how light interacts with matter and how we can use it in medicine, right? But when it comes specifically to photopharmacology, so once again, using light to control the activity of drugs, there are two main ways you can do that. So the simplest approach is something we called photocaging. What we do in photocaging, we take an existing drug, which does its job, it's validated, it's FDA approved, etc., and we look at how it binds to its target. We can do it differently. We can use molecular docking. We can use crystal structures if it has been co-crystallized. We can use structure-activity relationships. Doesn't matter. We try to identify a part of this drug which is key to its function. Yeah? And what we do then is once we identify this part of the drug, we silence it. We attach something to it to cap it. Yeah? Which means, if we do it correctly, the drug will stop working. Right? But this something that we attach is known as photocleavable protecting group or a photocage, which means under action of light, it can go to excited state and cleave the bond and be removed from the drug. So we chemically silence the drug, and then with light we unsilence it, we activate it locally, right? Wherever the light is shining. This is an irreversible process, that's very important. So once we remove the silencer, it's gone. It doesn't come back. So we can only activate, we cannot inactivate. This is a very simple approach to understand, I guess, right? You silence it, and with light you can unsilence it. It's relatively easy to design on a chemical level. I can look at a drug and with certain high success rates say which part of it we should silence for it to work, or to stop working, in fact. And we use this usually as our first approach. If we, as a research group, if we hit a certain biological target that we would like to photocontrol, photocaging is always our first approach because it's relatively simple, right? And since last year, we also have photocages that respond to red and near-infrared light, which means they can be activated deeply where we want it. And as a fun fact, in order to prove that in our papers, we have actually decided to use living tissue and embed our samples in that living tissue, or at least once living tissue, and see if light can really penetrate through it and activate it. And not having access to human models, we've gone to the market and trying to promote Dutch cuisine. We have tried Holland Senu and Speklab as our samples. The pictures in our paper are highly appreciated by people. If you check it, there is still the Dutch flag on a toothpick stuck to the Holland Senu. So I recommend this paper to everyone just for this, funny aspect at least. But there's a problem with this approach, of course, right? You locally activate a drug, but as any molecule, it's free to diffuse throughout the body, right? And if, let's say, this drug is a chemotherapeutic agent, a highly toxic compound, you would like it to be active only where you activate it, only at the cancer lesion, the metastasis, etc., right? You don't want it to be active everywhere else, causing side effects, because then your precision of light activation is kind of lost if it just, distributes itself. It's not necessarily a big problem because, of course, you locally activate it, so locally it has high concentration to do what it should, and then as it diffuses throughout the body, it gets very much diluted in huge volumes, so that the local concentrations will be much, much lower than where you shine light. But still, this is a key limitation of this method, that it doesn't stay local. And this is where the photoswitchable idea comes in, that we touched upon a bit in our previous part, in which we make drugs that you can with light activate, but also inactivate, right? So they have a switch on, but also switch off. And this switch off can be done with different color of light, so you can be switching them on and off with different colors of light, or in a simpler approach, you can dream of a molecule which in its thermally stable state is not biologically active, it doesn't do anything. You shine light on it, it goes to excited state and switches to an active state, which locally does its job. So, I don't know, is an enzyme inhibitor or receptor ligand or whatever, cures cancer, right? And then this active form is thermally unstable, so with a certain half-life it will switch itself back to the stable inactive form, right? If this half-life is correctly chosen, then you can dream of activating compound with light locally, and the moment that compounds go away from light beam, they will be switching themselves off, and even if they diffuse, no problem, right? So that's kind of the whole idea behind photoswitchable photopharmacology. And again, since a few years, we also have photo switches that can be operated with red and near-infrared light. It's much more difficult than for cages. It's much more challenging, but that's something that the field is very much moving to, and that's where we as chemists have probably the most to show, trying to develop those photo cages and photo switches that absorb a lot of light, preferably red near-infrared light. They go to excited state, and with very high probability, among all the different processes that we have described, they choose to go to the photo switching or photo uncaging process. So many of the students working with us actually take this as their main target, create new cages, new switches that can do those things.
And just for clarity, because maybe for the audience it's not quite obvious, what is on the molecular level the switching? What is happening to the molecule? What is the process that's taking place?
Most often, the switching process is either about creating bonds, but more often it's about switching bonds. So if you think about a simple double bond, right? You have two carbons, two nitrogens, etc., and between them there is a double bond. If you remember anything from your basics chemistry, you will remember that this double bond usually has two different energies. Let's call them E and Z, okay? Z if the substituents on double bond are the same side, E if they are on opposite sides, right? With light, we can usually switch between those two forms, right? If you realize that this double bond over here is embedded in a big molecule, switching will change the shape of the molecule. And if we are lucky, and if we design it correctly, we usually try to design it and it doesn't work, so we rely on being lucky. This change in geometry will translate itself into a change of activity of a drug in which this switch is sitting. It's kind of obvious if you think about it. The two different isomers, two different forms, are basically two different compounds, and it's could be expected two different compounds have two different potencies as drugs, right? So if you are able to switch between those two compounds, you can switch between a stronger and a weaker inhibitor, effector, ligand, you name it. So that's chemically what happens. Most often diisomerization of double bond.
Of course, and the shape is important because maybe as many people know that the geometry of the molecule is what determines the activity of the molecule eventually. It's more like a Lego game where it fits in the enzyme or it does not fit.
Exactly.
Right?
Well, the key and lock is probably the best, albeit not very precise, parallel over here, right? So if your enzyme that you want to inhibit, let's say, is a lock, then only one key fits to it, and if with light you change this key into something different, it doesn't fit anymore, right? Very simplistic way to think about that, but a good starting point, yes.
Yeah. And I was wondering from an economic point of view, is any drug that we have now convertible to a photo switch, or do we have to start a whole new market with whole new drugs that are photo switchable?
Well, once photopharmacology kind of exploded as a field and started growing, people started looking back at drugs that we already have, and it turned out that some of them actually are photo-switchable. By complete accident, nobody planned that yet, they just happen to contain those double bonds that you can isomerize with light, which must have been a really confounding issue for people who developed them, and suddenly, you know, depending under which light you're working, they might have had different activity. A small digression here, I do remember how my friends from hospital were working on an imaging agent, which tend to be nice and pure molecule when they analyzed it in their research lab, and then they went with the same molecule to analyze it in their GMP facility before they injected to humans, and it wasn't pure anymore. And they were struggling for a long time, like going from one room to the other. Like, what's the difference? The difference was the type of light bulbs that were in those two rooms.
Wow.
And in one of those rooms, there was a light bulb that was sending UV light as well, which isomerized that molecule. Crazy thing.
Level of control.
Yeah, it was photopharmacology, which was completely not, designed to
Not
be like
intentional
that.
at
It was
all.
actually a problem. Yes. There is another possibility over here. We not only look at existing drugs that made it to the market and make them photoswitchable, we start looking at drugs that failed to make it to the market because they were too toxic, right? And since maybe we are having a way to control their toxicity in time and space, we should revisit those molecules and see if we can now use their possible photoswitching to our advantage, right? That's kind of the story behind the combretestatine analogs, one of the most successful photopharmacology tools developed by our colleagues and competitors in Munich, in which combretestatine A4, which is not on the market because of being too toxic, has been converted just by changing 2 carbons in it to 2 nitrogens and forming a fantastic photoswitch that upon irradiation becomes a potent toxic compound, and left in the dark is almost benign. So we don't have to rediscover everything again, but again, from the pharmacy perspective, the fact that we change the drug by putting a photoswitch into it probably means that we need to revisit all its toxicity again and all the legal proceedings before we can get to it, to the market.
Great, great.
Yeah.
Well, I think we have covered quite a lot for photoswitching and photopharmacology.
Exactly.
Maybe
move on to molecular imaging. Perhaps. Yes.
Let me build a bridge then from what I just said
Yeah.
to molecular imaging, because hey, we're in the academia, right? We are the universities. We have our resources, which are to some extent limited. Being a professor at the university, I will probably never be able to bring a photopharmacological agent as a drug to a market. I don't have this kind of money. And you guys should know very well the costs of bringing a new drug to a market. I don't know what it is these days, but it's good 15 years of work, 10 to 15 years, and how many $1 billion?
$1 billion, yeah.
Yeah, at least, right?
Yeah.
We don't have this kind of capacity here. Still, I, as a researcher, would like to bring something to the bedside, right? It's a dream. Imagine coming up with something, drawing it on the blackboard, and then within a predictable and limited time span of not more than 100 years, bringing this drawing on a blackboard that you just came up with to a patient and helping this patient, right? And that's why in my group we kind of focus on 2 different aspects of using photons, so using light. One is photopharmacology, making drugs, and we are here building the basis, hopefully for companies in the future to pick this up, bring it to bedside. But we also focus on molecular imaging because, and we're going to get to nuts and bolts of that in a second, right?
Yeah.
But molecules that we develop there for certain reasons are much easier to be brought to patients. Even for us in academia, with our limited resources, this is thinkable. This is something that can be done, mostly for imaging, not for therapy, but still, if it allows a doctor to see something that they haven't seen before, I, as a scientist, would be happy and fulfilled if I can create something like that.
Fantastic. Yeah, so as you said, your dream is to actually bring something, and the opportunity is there. We would first like to kind of pull it back a little bit and look at maybe breaking down the different imaging techniques and maybe what parts of the electromagnetic spectrum they use, because we already have quite a wide selection.
Yeah.
So generally speaking, maybe let's start with CT scans and MRIs. We did mention them previously. Could we first kind of just start, or specifically MRIs, because I think we glanced over that, but we didn't really speak about it in much detail. Could we start with that and what makes that unique, and then move on to the more complex ones?
Okay, absolutely. So molecular imaging or medical imaging, let's look at a bit broader. Medical imaging, for me, is mostly the ways of looking into human body, looking for abnormalities, malignancies, etc., preferably without cutting the patient open, right? The simplest, if you don't know what medical imaging can be, think about you possibly break a leg, you go to a hospital and they get an x-ray, right? And suddenly we see your bone, which is either one bone or two bones because you just broke it, and nobody has touched you with a scalpel, right? So we're able to look into your body without cutting it open. So there are two general ways of looking into human body. You need to form an image, right? You need to form your, X-ray, black, white, bone there, no bone over here. To do that, you can do two things. You can either bring some kind of energy to the patient, and then your patient will absorb, the different parts of your patient's body will differently absorb this energy. And if behind the patient you have a detector, you can see what came through, right? Another thing is you can bring an imaging agent into the patient and then start looking where it went. And almost all of those methods are based on the input of energy in the form of photons, right? The only thing that we mentioned before that is not relying on photons is ultrasound imaging. That's really sound in, sound out. But okay, let's leave it on the side. And let's think about photons as the carriers of electromagnetic energy being used for imaging of humans. Now, those photons have very different energies, right? And photons that, we encounter in the world come from very different energy, or they have very different energies all across the electromagnetic spectrum, right? So if we start, actually in the previous hour, we have kind of looked at the middle of the spectrum, more or less. We have looked at the specific, very narrow range of energies that we call visible light, right? That's the energies that our eyes have evolved to perceive. That's why it's called visible. And they are used in optical imaging as we described it. But of course, there are also photons which are of lower energy than that. Infrared, etc., all the way to radio waves. So those things have very low energy and they can be used, for example, in MRI imaging, right? So those radio waves are used to send energy into humans that we put into strong magnetic field in MRI scanners. Non-invasive method, right? As long as you don't have a pacemaker, because if you do, please don't go into MRI scanner because it's a strong magnetic field, right? As long as you don't have any, metal implants or whatever, you'll be fine. So people just are put into a strong magnet, and then we send radio waves into them and basically see what happens. So that's the way of using weak photons. MRI imaging is fantastic to look at anatomy because different tissues in our body will have different relaxivities. They will create different intensity of signal. Let's put it like this very simply. So our MRI scanner can interpret it and, depending on how we program it, it can be showing hard tissues differently, soft tissues differently, water differently, etc. So we have fantastic look into human body with that. Then if we go to higher energies, we have the visible light with all the optoacoustic imaging. If we go even higher in energies, we're getting to photons that are actually from the X-ray and gamma range. So very high energy photons, right? These photons are a bit less non-invasive, right? They are so hard, carry so much energy that they can be considered to be ionizing radiation. They can actually mess with your molecules, ionize them, and create damage. So it's still a safe imaging, but let's not do it every day to every patient, right? So what happens there are two different ways of imaging. First of them is we take X-ray photons and we let them pass through human body. That's our X-ray scan if you break a leg. Or we let them pass from different directions through human body and we create a 3D
Wow.
tomogram called computed tomogram, CT scan or CAT scan, right? So this is the use of heavy energy X-rays. And of course, there is a certain radiation dose associated with that, but in comparison, it's still safe, right? The risks associated with single CT scan are so low that we agree to doing that, and that's not in itself an ethical issue. But we're still looking at anatomy, right? Sometimes what we try to find with imaging is so small or so anatomically inconspicuous that we need a bit more of a molecular blueprint, right? Certain, let's say, small tumors will not be seen in those scans, but they have a bit different biochemistry to them, right? So we need to be doing not only medical imaging, but molecular medical imaging. We need to start imaging molecules. We need to start imaging receptors, enzymes that might be overexpressed in those tissues of interest. Which brings us to either optical imaging, where, as you remember, we target fluorescent molecules to certain targets, and then we usually open the patient and start looking inside because light is not very good in penetrating human body. But there's an alternative to that. Instead of putting a fluorescent molecule on your targeting agent, you can put a radio tracer. So basically, you can put an isotope, fluorine-18, carbon-11, many of those, that will be able to create, wherever it goes, will be able to send a signal that we can then find. And if the signal is actually high energy photons, they will travel through our body almost unobstructed. Okay? And that's the whole idea behind PET and SPECT imaging. So we're getting now to very high energy photons. What we can do now is take this targeting agent, label it, let's say, with fluorine-18 molecule, and we do it at UMCG. We actually have our own cyclotron at UMCG that produces fluorine-18, right? So it's really advanced radiochemistry. We as chemists, I actually don't do that. I'm always impressed by people who do that. They work in fume hoods which are built of lead to protect themselves from this radiation. And whenever they work with more of it, they actually use robots to do that because it's too dangerous. But what you can do then is inject your patient with a dose of such molecule that will find a tumor, right? And then what happens is really cool. So this fluorine-18, a molecule that bears fluorine-18, goes and accumulates where it should be. We put a patient in a PET camera, and what happens is fluorine-18 is unstable. It decays with a half-life of 110 minutes, and as it decays, it emits a positron, which is basically antimatter, right? Positron is the twin of electron, just the antimatter form of electron. It's positively charged, electron is negatively charged, right? So it shoots a small positron, and as antimatter meets matter, so a positron meets electron, they annihilate, right? There are certain weird books based on this idea of Dan Brown and I don't remember what, right? Antimatter and people explode, whatever. So it happens in human bodies. We do it at UMCG. We actually, well, people who do that, they use this effect in which positron and electron will annihilate, and as they do, they send two gamma photons, so photons of very high energy, in exactly opposite directions, okay? And those travel to human body almost, unbothered. We have now detector around the human body that catches those gamma photons. And if he catches two of them at the same time on opposite sides, it can say, hey, it's a real signal. It actually originated from somewhere over here, right? Okay. Since recently, we are one of the very few centers in the world that has a PET camera that covers almost 110 centimeters of human body. It's a kind of a tube into which you put a patient, and it catches all those gammas, and based on that, it can reconstruct an image where they came from. And the beauty, coming now back to bringing things to the clinic, the beauty of PET tracers, so those molecules that are targeted and they carry an isotope of them, or the beauty of optical imaging agent is that those methods of seeing things are so sensitive that to use them in patient, we don't have to inject very much, a lot of them, right? We are injecting microdoses,
Yeah.
which makes our life on, legal, toxic, etc. aspects much easier, because it's much easier to actually push those products all the way to clinical use without extensive toxicity screenings, etc., and without, all the legal hassle that creates lots of the costs and time that we talked about. So it is thinkable in academia to actually do it, to bring a PET tracer optical imaging agent from a drawing on the blackboard to first-in-human injections. It has been done by my colleagues at UMCG in the past, and I find it really, really impressive that we can do things like that, right?
Yeah.
So that's why, as I said, the second part of my group is also looking at using photons for imaging, exactly for reasons of like that.
Fantastic. And pushing the idea of kind of molecular and kind of radio tracers further, while researching this, I came to the term theranostics. And now this fascinated me because it creates this hybrid model of everything we've been kind of trying to do. So also, seeing something, but also trying to create a therapeutic out of it. Could you expand upon that and maybe give us some examples of what we could use?
Happy to, especially it's a tricky question. See, the term theranostics was actually, it originates, as far as I know, actually from PET field, so the positron emission tomography field. And we are now very much trying to take it away from them and expand and make it a bit broader in its meaning, right? Originally, what it means is treat what you see what you treat, right? So if you now imagine having a PET agent which is attached to a drug. Yeah. So you have a drug and you are able to follow its distribution using PET imaging, right? That will allow you to see what you're treating if you give the patient the same drug at higher doses, because you will see where it goes, right? It's very useful for medical companies who develop a new drug to turn it into a PET tracer and then go show the regulatory agencies, look, we actually see where it goes and what it does. So that's fantastic. But as an example of theranostics, imagine that you want to do immunoradiotherapy. So you want to take now an isotope which doesn't produce imaging agent that much, but it produces hard ionizing radiation in terms of electron or alpha particle or J electron, whatever. You can now attach an isotope that produces those nasty things to an antibody, inject it to a patient, it will go to where it should, and locally it will start burning away the tumors by radiation, right? But of course, for each patient, you have to be sure that this antibody actually goes where it should and how fast it gets cleared. So instead of putting an isotope that produces those nasty alphas, gammas, etc., alphas and beta particles, you can put a different isotope that produces gammas for imaging. And first inject the patient with that, see where it goes in that specific patient, see if the tumor can be infiltrated by those antibodies, because tumors really will defend themselves from many things. But if in this patient it does, you can now proceed with the therapeutic one, right? So you're going to see what you're treating, and then you can come back after your radiotherapy, you can come back to your gamma emitter, inject it again, and see if it doesn't bind there anymore, then maybe the tumors have been eradicated, right? So that's one option. But this is really, the nuclear medicine meaning of theranostics. We think broader. Maybe theranostics is simply a direct connection between therapy and diagnostics. That's where the name comes from, therapy, gnostics, diagnostics, right? Theranostics. Can we do it with not gamma photons or, those beta particles, alpha particles? Can we do it with visible light photons? I told you that we have optical imaging agents that absorb and emit light. I told you that we have photopharmacological agents that absorb light and, cure. It sounds like 1 + 1, right? Can we have a light emitting system from imaging that activates a light activatable drug? I would say this is still theranostics. Now I just need to convince all those bad people that this is the case. But yes, the whole idea of theranostics is gaining momentum now. And it really plugs into personalized medicine because especially in immunotherapies, immunotherapies emerged a decade or two ago as a holy grail of, using immune system and its main tools to actually treat cancers. And since then we found out that it works absolutely perfectly in, 20, 30% of population. So it works wonders. It cures people that otherwise would be, dead within a week. But it works only for some of them, and it's extremely expensive. Can we use now diagnostics first to stratify patients before therapy and be able to say they will respond and they will not? And now spend all this money on the responders or spend all those antibodies on the responders without wasting money on the non-responders for whom we can save this money for different therapies, right? So theranostics will allow us on a personal patient-to-patient level to stratify patient populations into those that require this therapy or not, right? If you think about all the different types of breast cancer, right? It's great by imaging to try to find out if this is, which subtype of breast cancer it is, and then adjust therapy to that, yes? So this is really going towards personalized medicine in the future where imaging is going to play an enormous role.
Yeah, that's almost covered everything. Very kind of concisely and perfectly. Honestly, I think it would be smart to kind of move towards the future, unless that you have any specific questions that you want to ask.
No, well, of course, it's interesting, and you always have questions. But for the sake of time, maybe we could move on to the more the future part. So, what do you think is the main research line within photopharmacology or even molecular imaging that's now a hot topic that people could pursue, or maybe students, future students with a startup or within academia can pursue and get something out of it?
Well, you might think in two ways. One way is focusing on diseases which are, so deadly, so horrible that this is the only alternative, right? So we really need to hit it with something very toxic without killing the patient. So we would like to activate this toxicity somewhere. The other option is to focus on low-hanging fruits, and the people who did the clinical trial with the eye, well, that's obvious, that's self-explanatory. We are working as well on skin diseases, right? Because that's where light will hit pretty close. And if you are working on a startup, you want to keep it simple without having to solve all those penetration issues, etc. So, it's going to build, right? We have to start from low-hanging fruits to show that this is in principle possible. And, based on that, people will probably believe in it more, and we can go deeper into other diseases. Cancer is a big topic and will remain so because, for photopharmacology, when we locally activate drugs, it will only make sense on diseases that are to some extent localized, right? We're not going to treat COVID with photopharmacology. That probably doesn't.
Not worth it.
Anything systemic is well, for systemic diseases we need systemic treatment. Everybody happy, right? So that's good. So cancer in that respect is probably a good target. Still not perfect because photopharmacology will be great for treatment of localized metastatic cancers, which don't exist. If it's localized, then it's probably not metastatic, right?
Okay, yeah.
So this is going to be a bit more difficult. But this is also where the idea of using imaging, so using molecules that will go to its target and then start emitting light in some way and activating locally the drug without operator having to choose where to activate, that's where it might become interesting, because then in many places where the metastases are, the treatment could be activated.
maybe antibodies, just having combine it with the immunotherapy, and it knows where it goes.
Exactly.
And then, well, you don't have to choose the place. It just goes to the place.
It goes to the place and locally emits light, for example, to activate therapy over there, right? So yes, that is definitely an option to make those photoimmunoconjugates. There might be something to be done for sure in the area of antibiotics, as we talked about, right? And we are heavily working on that because we recognize this to be a big problem for humanity. The challenge here is that we do, but companies rarely do. Now it's getting better, right? But our problem in antibiotics is that for many companies, the return on investment on antibiotics was basically none, because you work those 15 years and those billions of euros or dollars to develop antibiotics, and 5 years later, bacteria develop resistant, and your product is down in water. So that's but we realize that this is a problem, and our governments are incentivizing companies and researchers to work more on this. So maybe this is where photopharma makes a big difference. And then there are crazy ideas also from our friends around the world, like diabetes. What if you can have a molecule that under light promotes the excretion of insulin, and then you have your pancreas lined with LEDs? See, that's science fiction.
Okay.
But wait. So at the same time, you have a system that measures your glucose levels, and without your intervention, when it's too high, the signal gets sent, the light goes on, and in a kind of feedback loop, the homeostasis of sugar is regulated. Crazy? Crazy. But hey, we are in academia. We're allowed to do a bit of crazy.
That's what makes it interesting, I guess.
Yes.
Yes. Well, I think it's also good to mention that you're moving out of the UMCG and you're joining our faculty and our the GREB and the GREB Research Center, right?
Yes. Well, I'm not actually moving out of UMCG. I was still connected. I will stay connected there because of all the possibilities that we have described, and some of the compounds that I have described to you, we analyze not only on Hollandse Nieuwe, but we also analyze them on human cadaver models, which is very eye-opening. So, working at UMCG gives us lots of access to imaging facilities, expertise, colleagues, friends, and most importantly, doctors and surgeons who come to us. And, instead of doing our typical academic, let's find a solution and then search for a problem for it, we actually have practicing physicians coming and saying, this is my problem. There's a real problem, solve it.
Nice.
Okay? So we definitely stay embedded in UMCG as well, but yes, indeed our group will be moving to GRIP, where we will start a completely new department of medicinal chemistry, photopharmacology, and imaging, which I now proudly announce. I'm hoping to finalize all the paperwork soon, and be seeing you guys next semester already.
Fantastic.
And maybe start teaching first year students somewhere in next year. So yes, that's something to look for.
Well, looking forward for it. This is of course a win for our faculty.
Thank
it's very
you.
interesting stuff to hear about during the study.
It sounds like a natural home for our research, indeed.
Yeah, I think so as well.
Fantastic.
I think we covered everything. Thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you for
the
the
energy was
invitation.
great, and your passion is also greater. I think you inspired me, and I know that you will inspire a lot of people with your talk. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much. My only message to pharmacy students, study chemistry. Chemistry is useful and important. Yes, thanks guys so much. This was my first ever podcast. I was actually still talking to friends today asking what podcast is, because I'm kind of, a dinosaur when it comes to things like that. But now I better understand the difference between radio thing or radio interview and a podcast. So
thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
all right.
Oh, great.